everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. If you've been following our Solidarity Friday episodes, this is going to be a little bit different and one of our formal interviews. So today on the show, we are very pleased and honored to have Brian Muraresku on the show. If you haven't heard of Brian's work, he is the author of the Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. A little bit more about Brian. Brian graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Brown University with a degree in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. As a member of the New York Bar, he has been practicing law internationally for 5 years. In 2016, he became the founding executive director of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, whose work has been featured in CNN, ESPN, Vice, and The Washington Post. In arbitration with the NFL, he represented the first professional athlete in the United States to request a therapeutic use exemption for cannabis. Awesome. And Brian lives outside of Washington, D.C. with his wife and 2 daughters. And again, he's the author of the Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. If you haven't stumbled across this book before or Brian's work, I'll read a little bit about the book. But chances are, if you've been following us here at Psychedelics Today, I'm guessing there's a good chance you've probably already seen Brian's work or, found him elsewhere. I know he's been having a lot of press lately, and it's really great. So the Immortality Key. So the most influential religious scholar in the 20th century, Houston Smith, once referred to it as the best kept secret in history. Did the ancient Greeks use drugs to find God? And did the earliest Christians inherit the same secret tradition? Because of the origins of Western civilization and the future of the world's biggest religion are at stake, controversy has swirled around these questions for generations. A bitter and often vicious debate, only fueled by the lack of any hard scientific evidence to prove the case until now. So this book follows Brian's 12-year global investigation into the archaic roots of the religious experience, equal parts deep history and cutting-edge science. New evidence suggests the ritual use of psychedelics across Greco-Roman world and its later influence on the Christian Eucharist. The Immortality Key reconstructs a suppressed history of women consecrating the forbidden drugged Eucharist that was later banned by the Church Fathers. Women who were later targeted as witches during the Inquisition when Europe's sacred pharmacology largely disappeared. If the scientists of today have reconstructed the technology of yesterday and God is now available in a pill, then Christianity is in a crisis unless it returns to its roots. So there you have it. Little blurb, a little background about the book. Yeah, highly recommend you check it out. You download an audio version on Audible. I'm sure it's available elsewhere. And then ebook, or you could order the book. Yeah, I think this is a really great interview with Joe and Brian. Learned a ton, and I've listened to a couple of Brian's interviews, so I was able to learn a little bit more. And this is just a really fascinating conversation and topic. I know there's been a lot of debate about was the kykeon an ergot derived concoction? Did the ancient Greeks use kind of LSD like concoction that was derived of ergot? So really kind of exploring this history and what is that. How does that change history if early religions were using these sacraments? And does that change the course of history and religion if that is to be true? So some things to consider. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Brian Muraresku, and we know you're going to love it. Some updates. So we are kicking off our Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists course. Begins January 7th and ends on February 25th. This is a hybrid course, so you'll get lifetime access to our online material, interviews, masterclasses, and you will use the classroom time on Zoom on those days. It's on Thursdays. We have 2 groups, one at 2 p.m. Eastern and the other one's at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we'll just come together, chat about the material, maybe present a little bit, and really just have this opportunity as a classroom to dig into all the little nuances surrounding this topic. And, sometimes we get some special guests to come in and present. So definitely don't want to miss this. If you or working with clients, if you're a clinician, if you're in the healthcare world, a coach, really, if you're just working with clients and clients are starting to come in asking questions about psychedelics and you don't really know where to start or begin, we're here to help you. We want to help you kind of get up to speed and, learn how to navigate some of these conversations and just understand the history and, the use of psychedelics and safety and harm reduction and all that stuff. So you can check that out, psychedelicEducationCenter.com. And again, classes kick off January 7th. If you want to support the show, you can do so by following us on our social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, just at Psychedelics Today. And if you want to support the show, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're feeling called to it, we'd love a review on iTunes. Helps boost our ratings and helps to get our message out there some more. You could also support us by donating to our Patreon. So that's patreon.com/psychedelics today. And if you can't do that, no worries. I think one of the best ways to support the podcast and Psychedelics Today is to just repost and share our content. So if you love the podcast, share that around. If you're on Instagram, maybe do a repost and just, let people know that you're listening. Just help to spread the word. So I think that is it for today. And I hope everybody enjoys this episode with Brian Muraresku, and we will catch you on the other side.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. We have a new and different kind of guest for you today. Brian Muraresku, author of The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. How are you doing today, Brian?
I'm pretty awesome. Good to be here.
Great. So you're in South America currently, Uruguay. It's pretty amazing.
I am I'm in Uruguay, which is one of the most COVID-free countries in the Western Hemisphere, and I won the lottery with a wife who was born and raised here. So we have our daughters in school, we get plenty of sunshine, and we're heading into a few months of summer.
Outstanding! Wow, yeah. As we're slipping into winter here, possibly one of the darkest winters many of us will live through.
I feel you. I feel you, man.
Well, that's pretty cool. You're down there. Great. And so I initially encountered your work on Joe Rogan. I made it 20 minutes into the interview before realizing I needed to stop listening, buy the book, and jump in. It's like, okay, Graham is so enthusiastic about this, Graham Hancock, that, obvious that to me is the thing that spoke volumes. So it's like, I don't really even need to hear Brian talk here. I'm just going to jump in. And you were impressive, though, in that first bit. And I worked through your book twice.
Wow.
Yeah. Before I even got the hard copy. I got the hard copy now, finally. But the images in here are unbelievable. But I guess before we start jumping into your work, Brian, let's maybe kind of lay out a little picture of you and your past. Like you started as an undergrad studying classics. Is that right?
That's right. And I mean, that's the reason I went to college, is because of classics. I may not have gone to college without it. So I do sometimes say with a straight face that classics saved my life, or at least laid a lot of groundwork for what came afterwards. I got this scholarship to go to a Jesuit prep school in Philadelphia, where I was born and raised, and never really felt like I belonged there, but Latin was mandatory and Greek was an elective. I wound up picking both. And by the time I was a senior, I kind of wanted to be a priest or a classics professor. And so thanks to the Jesuits and my mentors in high school there, I kept it going.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah. And it was kind of interesting how you phrased it at one point, like you were just blown away by how interesting Greek and Latin were. And that they seemed to open, like what I got from it was that it seemed to open new worlds for you. That you like kind of like a Hogwarts thing.
Yeah, it did. I got, I was lost in my studies as a teenager. I would rush home after school and get through my math and social studies and history. And then I'd sit there with my Latin and Greek all night by myself until midnight, just poring over this stuff. And in a weird way, it always kind of came natural, despite the fact that Latin was my very first foreign language ever. And which is a weird one to pick up. But I stuck with it and always kind of felt like I was one of those kids in Dead Poets Society or something. And there are real mysteries there, and it's not that clear at first. You're studying vocabulary and syntax and grammar and doing what you do, but then it begins to dawn on you that you're peering back into time, and you have access to something that is quickly vanishing today.
Right. It's a little alarming how quickly this stuff is kind of becoming less valuable. But I guess it's understandable, but it's like we still need this kind of class of people, kind of like in Hermann Hesse's glass bead game. Like we need these Castilians or something to like help, hold on to this so we don't totally lose it.
I do think so. In the book, I do mention this prophecy from the 4th century AD. I'm not going to dive into it too much, but there was this episode in history recorded by the historian Zosimus about this guy, Praetextatus, this Roman hierophant who was an initiate into these ancient mysteries that I write about. And as the Roman Empire is about to shut down all this crazy pagan stuff, Praetextatus essentially says something like, if you kill these mysteries, these ritual ceremonies, these visionary experiences, if you kill them, you're going to kill us. And there was the idea that some of this stuff was bound up not just with Greek existence, but with human existence itself, which is, a lot to have on your shoulders. But for a relatively, antiquated discipline, it seems like today, I think there is importance to this material. And it was very, very common to study the classics. I mean, the founders of America knew some Latin and Greek. In a prior generation, it wasn't that uncommon. It's now quickly dying. And it seems like it's totally irrelevant. And I totally agree in some sense, which is why I went to law school and didn't become a classics professor because I was tired of being broke. But, it was always at the back of my mind that there was something very valuable there. And this notion of forgotten wisdom is a very real thing.
I loved Graham Hancock's line from years ago, like we're a species with amnesia. I feel like it's, still quite relevant.
Right. But my tagline is we're a species who doesn't study Latin and Greek.
Also that. Yeah. Because a lot of our memories are stored in those languages. That's for sure.
And the language we're speaking right now, 60% of which is comprised of some kind of Greco-Roman roots, which we don't often think about. But it really did give rise not just to our language, but to all the things that we take for granted. Not to say that the Greeks invented it. There's no Greek miracle. And they were the beneficiaries of all these traditions and high civilizations that came before them, like in Egypt and Sumeria and the Near East, etc. But as it comes to us, democracy, the arts and sciences, and we had a pretty consequential election last week, and we're trying to keep this republic alive. These are all things that came from the Greeks through the Romans to us. And for them, Greek was a sacred language. Greek is still a sacred language in the Greek Orthodox Church. And then Latin was a sacred language, still is a sacred language if you're walking through the Vatican. I mean, my grandmother went to Mass every Sunday learning Latin, which died at some point. And so all this stuff, it's funny. It's quickly disappearing. And part of the reason I wrote this book is to try and communicate the importance of this stuff to the average person.
So this is a long and complicated story, but I think let's kind of do a rough sketch. So I loved your argument that beer being the first biotechnology was a really big revolution. And it was likely that there were a lot of plants with active drugs in them added to this beer. One thing I thought I got a little confused about was, in particular, this topic of graveyard beers. Can you explain to people what that is or why that's important?
What the heck is a graveyard beer?
Yeah,
I don't know. I think I coined the term.
I think you did.
Mainly, I start in Eleusis, which is the spiritual capital of the ancient world, or at least the site of the most famous mystery traditions, these secret rites and ceremonies that called to everybody from Plato to Marcus Aurelius, and we think survived for about 2,000 years in ancient Greece. There was a sacrament involved, and we don't know the specifics, and we don't know how or when it was consumed during these annual initiation rites, which only happened once a year there in Eleusis, about 13 miles northwest of Athens. But there was a sacrament of some kind involved. And we know from the ancient sources that it contained barley, water, and mint. And when you look at that, and I talked to a beer scientist in Germany about this, it kind of reads like a rudimentary recipe for beer, if you think about it. But there was this idea in 1978 in that controversial book, The Road to Eleusis by Wasson, Hofmann, and Ruck, that it wasn't really barley itself, but ergotized barley, barley that had been infected with this naturally occurring fungus, the same fungus from which Albert Hofmann himself was able to synthesize LSD back in 1938. And so, according to him, if he did this by accident, the question was it possible that some proto-chemist in the archaic past may have stumbled upon very similar biochemical technology? It's not impossible. We've never recreated this barley potion in the laboratory with sufficiently potent alkaloids. So there are big question marks here. But the notion of a psychedelic sacrament was planted in 1978, and there were others who talked about it beforehand. But I mean, given that, what I spent my time on the past 12 years is trying to track down scientific evidence for that. And fortunately, there's this new discipline, archaeochemistry, relatively new discipline, that's been growing quickly over the past 20 years. And it's archaeologists and chemists going out there in the field and testing these ancient cups, chalices, vessels, troughs, barrels, you name it. And they find residue. They find organic residue and they test it. And for the first time, we can say pretty definitively what our ancestors were imbibing. And turns out the story goes all the way back 12,000 years to Göbekli Tepe, where this same scientist I talked to in Germany, Martin Zarnkow, did in fact discover traces of calcium oxalate, which is this telltale sign of beer fermentation, many, many thousands of years ago. And so it doesn't just show up there, but it shows up in this sanctuary, this ritual site of this giant megalithic architecture, where the German Archaeological Institute itself is saying that something ecstatic is happening here. This is some kind of pilgrimage site, some kind of religious site where the living are interacting with the dead. And they found skulls on site. They postulate some kind of skull cult. What we surmise is that some kind of spooky ceremony is happening there, that maybe this beer, if we can further confirm it, was facilitating. And so hence the graveyard beer. And I traced that idea for thousands of years from prehistory all the way into ancient Greece.
Right. So it seems like you argued pretty well that like the Proto-Indo-Europeans kind of went in two directions from around Göbekli Tepe, and having this beer was a pretty good thing to have as a commodity if you're going to be traveling and meeting new strangers. Was there evidence that, did Göbekli Tepe, did it predate Soma in the Rig Veda? At least those textual references? It seems like that is the case, and that was kind of part of what you were arguing for.
Yeah, and it's a novel argument. I haven't seen it before. I mean, I think any linguist would certainly say so. I think most archaeologists would say so too. We don't really have any evidence, any biochemical evidence for soma, which for those who don't know is this ritual beverage that was consumed in the Vedic tradition, and it's recorded in the Rig Veda, some of the oldest literature from the Vedic canon. And it's recorded in Sanskrit, which was one of my passions as an undergrad, and Sanskrit itself, we think, is derived from Proto-Indo-European. If you think about the name Indo-European, it's that family of languages, the most successful family of languages in human history, by the way, that seems to have spread east and west from this central area in Eurasia. And we're not entirely sure where, and folks argue about where this homeland was. According to the Kurgan hypothesis, it was kind of in this area in the Ukraine between the Black and Caspian Seas. According to others, it was in Anatolia. But somewhere in that region, these languages, and you would think these traditions, begin migrating east and west a very long time ago. And again, some put it kind of like in the Bronze Age, not much before that. There are others who place it much, much earlier, closer to the time of Göbekli Tepe, which is interesting to think about. And if there was beer, and if it was sacramental, and if there was this religious tradition, these are all big ifs. I mean, the even bigger if is, did this somehow spread east to influence the soma of the Vedic tradition many thousands of years later? And did it somehow spread west to influence the Kukion, that sacramental potion at Eleusis. I mean, frankly, we don't know. There's thousands of years of history we need to start filling in there, but it's kind of one of these big what if questions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a super interesting concept. I loved the idea that, this is the cradle of civilization, right? And why wouldn't it have spread that way? Seems quite logical. Like, I guess the stumbling block I always get is that Graham Hancock's always in the back of my mind, going, things just keep getting older and older. Like, oh, shit. Like, where is my timeline? I don't have a safe timeline anymore. But, we have to follow the evidence, right? And adapt as evidence kind of progresses, I guess.
Right. I mean, I don't know how far, and even in the book, I mean, this all artificially starts at the agricultural revolution, this same period we're talking about, where Göbekli Tepe essentially comes out of nowhere about 12,000 years ago. I mean, you have hunters and gatherers very quickly transitioning into this settled, seemingly permanent religious site at Göbekli Tepe, and we don't know why they're there. It's not a settlement. They're not living there, but they are making this seasonal pilgrimage, it seems, for a couple thousand years in deep prehistory, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before Egypt and the high civilizations. We don't know where this comes from or why, but if it's possible that one of these sacraments, these beer sacraments, really did start there and wasn't just a simple beer sacrament, maybe something that was spiked, maybe something altogether more magical. I mean, it seems logical to try and follow that line. And that's why I follow the scholarship of Colin Renfrew at Cambridge, who has this whole Anatolian hypothesis. I mean, his hypothesis does line up fairly well with a very old tradition of brewing and these graveyard beers. Maybe it goes back a lot further than that, but I kind of start there just to see how we can start the conversation.
Yeah, such an interesting concept, and so I guess the mysteries that we have maybe the most discussion around with these probably psychedelic potions. I hate the fact that we don't have super firm evidence from the site, by the way. But I do, I just have the assumption and say it that they were drinking psychedelic, some sort of psychedelic potion. And, this is something that's, it's almost like one of our psychedelic gospels almost. It's like part of the mythos we have to assume, kind of. But, it's an interesting thing. Like, everybody who was anybody in the ancient world, from Marcus Aurelius to Plato and before and after, like, was involved in these mysteries at Eleusis. And in a lot of ways, they're kind of like we kind of assume they're a foundation for Western culture in a lot of ways, but it's kind of creepy how little we know about them. How do you like to discuss these rites or this kind of 2,000-year tradition?
Yeah, I like to refer to it as the real religion of the ancient Greeks. I mean, just to take a big step back, I talked about some of the legacies of this civilization, from democracy in the arts and sciences to literature and philosophy and the very concept of a university. I mean, all these inheritances are the things that we associate with the very literate Greeks, right? And there stands Eleusis at the center of it all. And it didn't just call to the Greeks, it called to the Romans too. I mean, the very best and brightest, not just from Athens, but from Rome, when one empire replaced another. And they were seen as so important, so central, so integral to life at the time that even Cicero, a Roman in the 1st century BC, he referred to Eleusis as the most exceptional and divine thing that Athens ever produced, right? So it wasn't democracy, the arts and sciences, etc. It was Eleusis. And specifically, it was this beatific vision that is almost universally attested at Eleusis. Now, whether that is psychedelically facilitated or not, the point is there was this vision. I mean, one of the gold standard scholars, this German scholar, or at least writing in German, Karl Kerényi, in the 1960s, he calls this vision that was experienced at Demeter's temple at Eleusis a beatific vision. He borrows the language from mystical Christianity because that's the kind of testimony that survives. I mean, all we have are hints and clues, but we do have, little testimony from folks like Aristotle, who said that the initiates went to Eleusis not to learn something, but to experience something. And Plato writes poetically about a blessed sight and vision that he witnesses in a state of perfection. And this goes on and on for generations and generations. They saw something. Now, the thinking for a long time was that, maybe it was the theatrical performance, maybe there was, something happening in this temple that has been lost to time. And then that book I mentioned in 1978, The Road to Eleusis, was saying, as long as we're talking about a vision, why can't it be something that was produced internally? Why couldn't it be one of these great epiphanic psychedelic visions? And so as a hypothesis, it makes sense just based on the way people talked about this experience. It was a once in a lifetime experience that essentially erased the fear of death and made these initiates immortals. And weirdly, which is why I picked this up in the first place, it's very, very similar to the testimony that comes from the volunteers in the Johns Hopkins experiments with psilocybin. It's, again, a once in a lifetime single dose of psilocybin seems to result in these profound mystical transformations in people, including atheists, who will describe it as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And so it's all circumstantial, but you can see how some of these puzzle pieces come together.
Right. It's so far in the past that we have to kind of work with circumstantial evidence to kind of like have any kind of real idea what was going on. We've been working through some pre-Socratics in our philosophy class, and it's quite spotty what we actually have from some of these individuals. So, we try our best, from context and history and, everybody's testimony about everybody. And, we get something eventually, hopefully, even if it's debatable. But yeah, like I tend to believe, if it was something like, fasting plus running or like hiking a marathon kind of deal. And, then you're up for 4 days, like, yeah, something might happen, or like doing something like holotropic breathwork, something might happen, but that's pretty easy to replicate relative to having some sort of secret potion. I think the argument's just better if it's a drug. It seems more sensible to me.
Right. Well, I mean, that's certainly what Wasson, Hofmann, and Ruck thought in 1978. And then this idea of an ergotized beer, right, a graveyard beer, again, in the abstract does make a lot of sense, and there just wasn't much scientific data to support it, which is why, I took it upon myself to dig through those archaeobotany journals to see if there was anything to this, because as far as we're aware, no real evidence has come along to support it. And step by step, I was going through the literature and eventually found this place in Spain, which I don't want to jump to and spoil the book for your audience, but I'm happy to talk about what I discovered in Spain.
Well, so this religion, ostensibly about agriculture, explaining the seasons, having a touch in the underworld, Persephone, Demeter, Hades, etc., and like this is just a way that they were able to explain a lot of what was going on just with that myth alone, and then getting a real taste of it, and probably having, like you were saying earlier, Göbekli Tepe, probably some sort of spooky ritual. Like there's probably some interesting, things that came from that, and really, allowed people to say, nope, I'm going to keep this a secret for the rest of my life. Unless you're somebody like Alcibiades, who said like, oh no, I'm just going to have some cool parties with this thing and get in big trouble and have to leave and then get invited back somehow. So he was like a big general in Athens, I think around the time of Socrates and Plato, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah, he was one of Socrates' star disciples there.
Yeah. Somehow he was not killed by Athens. He was more just kicked out of Athens for profaning the mysteries. But then they allowed him back, which I always thought was kind of awkward. Do you have any speculation on how he might have been able to redeem himself for those other people? Like, this is a weird mystery for me.
Yeah, maybe he was very persuasive.
That's probably it.
I talk about him as the Ed Snowden of the ancient world. He was ostracized for being implicated in this scandal that you're referring to, which is, if you Google the profanation of the mysteries, there was this series of events in 414 BC in Athens at wealthy homes across the city, there were lots of folks, not just him, implicated in this giant scandal where they are imitating the mysteries of Eleusis. And we know from the ancient sources that wine is being consumed in as part of these, house parties where people are trying to create this experience of meeting the goddesses. Right? These were very secret, very sacred rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. So the Lady of the Grain and her daughter, who's abducted into the underworld, and then resurrects at the right time in spring for the blossoms to come in full fruit again. But it's essentially, it's a seasonal myth. It's a fertility myth. But for the Greeks, they didn't read that myth maybe the way that we were taught it in high school mythology. Again, I don't think the Greeks, Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, I don't think that these folks were under the impression that Poseidon was stationed out in the ocean holding a trident, or that Zeus was hurling thunderbolts here and there. For them, religion mattered the same way that the arts and sciences matter. They're very skeptical people. And I think that Eleusis was their way of finding genuine meaning. And like I mentioned earlier, it was the thing that at least one initiate, Praetextatus, in the 4th century AD, it was the thing that he said, bound the whole human race together. I mean, really held some kind of compact between humans and the earth and the cosmos. I mean, what could that possibly have been?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit before, and Denise, I'm sorry ahead of time for not asking. I forgot to talk about you, but I started to have conversations with, oh man, I never actually asked her how to pronounce her last name, Denise Demetriou, who's a professor at UCSD, who you talk about, who potentially did some really interesting work. I think she was responsible for that site in Spain that you were kind of hinting at. Or was it France? I actually kind of forget.
It's in Catalonia, in northeast Spain.
Okay. And like this really interesting idea that there was a lot more commerce than we can really understand was happening back then. There were colonies. Athens had colonies, or like the Greeks had colonies all over the Mediterranean. And there were these, you called them Greek Vikings, the Phaeacians.
Yes.
They're going all over the place. It's really amazing. And, if you have a colony on the other side of the Mediterranean, do you really want to go back to like celebrate your mysteries in, Eleusis once a year or whatever? Like maybe it's economical to set up something near you. And I thought that was one of the more impressive ideas you had. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, of course, like that makes a lot of sense. How do you, I hope we're not spoiling too much for people, but you found some great evidence outside of Eleusis. And that really kind of, to me, was one of the most amazing parts of the book. You're like, oh, look, evidence right out there. Not necessarily Eleusis, but Greek colony, probably some at least initiates from the rites were there. And how do you like to talk about that?
No, I think it is worth mentioning. I mean, it is some of the most compelling data in my mind that's emerged over the past 42 years since The Road to Eleusis first came out. Here's this crazy hypothesis about this ergotized beer, and it essentially sends Carl Ruck's very burgeoning classical career into a nosedive. In 1978, this guy, Carl Ruck, who's now 85 years old, by the way, trained at Harvard and Yale. He was the chair of the classics department at Boston University. And he teams up with these older guys, Wasson and Hofmann, who were kind of at the end of their careers or enjoying early retirement. And here's this 42-year-old classics professor, just a bit older than I am now, who credits the Greeks with being high on drugs, essentially, in their holiest and most sacred ceremonies. And it wasn't well received by the academy. And there wasn't much science to turn to, as I keep mentioning. After I started reading some of those experiments coming out of Hopkins and that circumstantial evidence about, wow, here's this beatific vision that people seem to be having now, this deeply mystical experience that has all these implications for anxiety and end of life distress. Maybe the same thing was in the past. It's exactly what Gordon Wasson talked about, by the way, the guy who's credited with rediscovering psilocybin-containing mushrooms in the 1950s. his thought on that experience was that he'd stumbled across something that very much could have happened in antiquity and that could be responsible for the mysteries. He actually writes this in an article in Life magazine in 1957. I mean, so all the pieces are there, but we were missing the data. And so, going through the literature a couple of years ago, and it took me many years to find, I stumbled across this archaeological site in Catalonia called Mas Castellar de Pontos. It's been excavated since 1990 by this very talented Spanish archaeologist Enriqueta Pons. And what she found there was nothing less than a Greek sanctuary. It's the only way to put it. It's a bit inland from the coast, and this well-known Greek colony called Emporion, founded in 575 by these Phocians. Peter Kingsley, the great scholar, refers to them as the Vikings of antiquity. They found this place Emporion in the 6th century BC. It seems they go inland, and eventually, by the 5th century, there's this little outpost called Pontos. And by the 2nd century BC, there's this renaissance of Greek thought. And what the archaeologist finds there are all kinds of things that scream the Greek mysteries. She finds terracotta heads that look like Demeter and Persephone, the same Demeter and Persephone who we find all over the Greek-speaking world, and to whom the mysteries at Eleusis were dedicated. We find Greco-Italic amphoras. We find incense burners, on the face of which is carved one of the two goddesses, Demeter or Persephone. We find a bell-shaped crater showing Dionysus, which is dated to the 5th century BC. And at the very center of this spooky sanctuary hall, a domestic chapel, the archaeologist calls it, is an altar of Pentelic marble that was proven by petrographic analysis to have originated at the Mount Pentelicus quarry in Greece. It came from Greece. I mean, there was some Greek stuff happening there. And what's happening there, you mentioned Denise. She's one of the very, very few classicists who writes about this. And she writes about this environment as a multi-ethnic environment with lots of cross-cultural interactions, not only from the Greeks, but to the indigenous Indigetes, the local tribe that was there, and also the Celts. There's this mixing of influences all centered around some kind of mystery rites. And she says it's possible that at a site like this, you'd find an open access sanctuary. And I quote her on that quite a few times because it's such an important idea. It's the idea that not everybody had the time and money to schlep all the way back to Eleusis to celebrate the rites there, that maybe in the hinterlands of the Greek-speaking world, in a place like Catalonia, it was actually the perfect spot for this very ancient, archaic even, primordial Greek rite to find expression. And so the big question is, what was happening in this sanctuary? Well, in addition to all the Greek artifacts, they also found a tiny chalice, like a couple inches high, in the shape of the cup that was drunk by the god Dionysus. It's called a kantharos. And inside this kantharos, this little vessel, they found, by archaeobotanical analysis, they found the remains of beer. And so, giant exclamation point, kind of sounds like that ergotized beer that was hypothesized all the way back in 1978. So here's the thing. They didn't just find beer residue. They found the traces of ergot as well. And so here, for the very first time, is the first compelling data for this ergotized beer that was essentially just a myth, right? Just a hypothesis, just speculation. And there we find it where no one expected to find it.
To me, that was the most amazing part, that you were able to track all this down. They did have traces of this ergotized beer. Yeah, which, like you said, was totally just theory, speculation till that point. Yeah, so pretty amazing. What's really interesting to me is I don't actually know anybody who's tried to drink this, to make it or drink it.
Right.
I know a lot of people that take a lot of risks, and it's just kind of interesting. But yeah, like the fact that there's now real evidence and it had Greeks there at the same time, like it's just kind of, to me, is the best evidence we have to date of them using psychedelic. Well, in specific ergotized beer, like I think the pharmacopoeia, and you made a pretty good argument there, like their knowledge of plants and drugs was far greater than we ever would have really guessed on our own without being kind of, into it. Yeah. Like, do you, were, like, I know Galen wrote quite a bit about this stuff, but were there folks in ancient Greece or previously that wrote extensively about kind of pharmacological knowledge?
Oh, sure. You find it. I mean, it begins with Homer. I
Mm,
mean, the origins of Western literature. You find reference to pharmaca lugra, evil drugs that the witch Circe is mixing up in all these different potions for Odysseus and his mates. In fact, the verb kukio is used there for mixing up the same root of this kukion, this potion at Eleusis. And now, when Homer is writing about it, he's referring to a tradition that clearly predates Homer. And the question arises, how old was this technology? And it doesn't stop at Circe. You find writers like Theophrastus, the father of botany, writes all kinds of treatises on ancient plants. It continues into Dioscorides in the 1st century AD. I talk about him a lot in the book, the father of drugs, the father of pharmacology. He compiles this massive tome, the Materia Medica, which is one of the most enduring manuscripts from antiquity, by the way. And it's written at the same time that the Gospels themselves are being written in the 1st century AD. And in there, in just one book alone, Dioscorides has, I counted 56 detailed recipes for spiking wine with different plants and herbs and toxins. And so the idea of a very sophisticated understanding of the botanical landscape is obvious from the literature. And there's over 1,000 years of tradition to suggest that.
Awesome. Now, technical question for you, Brian. Kukion versus Kikion? Like, why? So you're the first person I've heard say Kukion.
Yeah.
And this might be over people's heads, but can you kind of explain the pronunciation a little bit?
Yeah, people keep yelling at me for this. I pronounce ancient Greek the way I was taught at Brown,
Right.
which is it's referred to as the Erasmian tradition. It's not the way modern Greek is spoken. It's not the way that liturgical Greek is spoken. So in the Kukion is how it's written with a U. Right. And in most cases, I will grant it that U becomes a Y in English. If you think of like hyper connected, the prefix there is huper. It's written with a U, but it comes into English as a Y. So Kikion is not incorrect. And I'm probably being too pedantic about it.
Oh, right on. It's ancient Greek with a Rhode Island accent. I got it.
That's my real answer going forward.
Cool. No, it's so funny. For a long time, I didn't realize where Brown was. And then I understood and I was like, oh, that's fascinating that it is like right in the middle of Providence. So, of course there's going to be some accents and it's, yeah. So, okay. This idea that, yes, we had this amazing pharmacological knowledge and there was a lot of use of plants and herbs and toxins, like poisons have probably been around for quite a while, used as weapons and whatnot. And, for fun, like a dose makes the toxin, right? Dose makes the poison. So they were probably doing all sorts of interesting things. And this idea of like mixing up the wine is a really fascinating thing. Like we think wine, we think, okay, I'm going to open that glass bottle, or there's going to be a barrel and it's all Cab Sav or whatever, Merlot. Like it's not the tradition they were living in at that point.
No. And it was, that one of the biggest points I try and make in the book is that ancient beer is not our beer and ancient wine is absolutely not our wine, which begs what I call like the most overlooked question of the past 2,000 years. How much wine, how many hundreds or thousands of gallons are poured every Sunday in churches across the planet for the more than 2 billion Christians who ought to be in Mass or some kind of Mass? And we all have this image of Da Vinci's Last Supper, and there's Jesus and his mates with the glasses of wine on the table. But the obvious question is, what kind of wine was it? Why do we assume that when wine is referenced in the New Testament, or when Jesus is talking about consuming his blood, why do we assume that's Cab Sauv? Why do we assume that that's the Pinot coming out of Napa? It's absurd. The second you start looking into ancient wine, you don't only find Dioscorides, whom I mentioned. Again, the same time the Gospels are being written, talking about all this spiked wine. I mean, spiked with absinthe and salvia and hellebore, frankincense, myrrh, henbane, mandrake, nightshades, all this crazy stuff. I mean, Dioscorides, about black nightshade in particular, says that it produces not unpleasant visions. He says fantasias ou aedes in Greek, which is, I mean, that's psychedelic. He's talking about visionary wine, but it's not just on paper. It's the actual science is now telling us that ancient wine was anything but the table wine of today. And what my colleague Andrew Coe at MIT, who I warmly consider the greatest archaeochemist in the world, he's responsible, amongst other things, for unearthing the world's oldest wine cellar at Tel Kabri. He published this well-known paper in 2014 about the discovery there. And what they found in the Canaanite period, so 1700 BC, before the Greeks, before the Romans, before Christianity, they found this ancient wine concoction. And it wasn't just fermented grapes. It was wine that was spiked with all kinds of funky stuff, like honey and storax, terebinth, cypress, cedar, juniper, mint, myrtle, and cinnamon. And it wasn't the only case of this stuff. And what Andrew Coe says at MIT is that, when you're looking at something like that, a wine find like that, you're talking about something more than just an average drink. It raises the prospect of a sacrament or a religious potion. Because there was this deep botanical understanding, again, where wine is not just wine. There was no difference. There was no dividing line between cuisine and pharmacology. I mean, wine at the time was medicinal, and it also had this sacramental overtone to it. And it seems to find its way all the way through the Greek tradition, where there's no word for alcohol. Okay, that's an Arabic word. The Greeks didn't have a concept of the ethanol that got you high. It was the wine itself, which was referred to as a pharmakon, where we get the word pharmacy or drug. I mean, they called wine a drug, I think, for that reason, because for them, it was so much more versatile than it is today.
Right. There's absolutely a lot more going on there. And like this idea that people were dying quite regularly from wine is also super interesting. And like this bridge from Alexander the Great to kind of like early Christian times, super interesting, where people were, what was it? Alexander the Great had some sort of festival and said everybody needs to drink the unmixed wine, and a bunch of people died, and possibly that's what he died from, a few weeks later or whatnot. And then how this kind of matches to kind of the proto-Christian world, where they're mixing up whatever, and a lot of people were allegedly dying in the texts. It's like, is there some sort of level of sophistication that is required and to mix wine? It seems like, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you're playing with poison. And it's you referenced, so that comes from the Deipnosophistae, one of the older cookbooks of antiquity. It's written by Athenaeus in the 3rd century AD. But he talks about this drinking contest that's sponsored by Alexander the Great after the death of his friend, in which 42 people wind up dying from drinking wine. Now, remember, as far as we know, there's no hard alcohol. There's no hard liquor. There's no distillation. That doesn't come into Europe until much, much later, maybe the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries AD. So you have to start asking yourself, what did the Greeks mean when they spoke about all this akratos wine? And that's wine that's unmixed. It's a very, very common term in ancient Greek. They were always cutting their wine, cutting it with water to make it less potent. And even the contest of Alexander is not, we don't think it's alcohol poisoning or over drinking, because there are other references from the same book, the Deipnosophistae, where this guy Erastichzenos, for example, dies from drinking just 2 cups of this akratos wine. He dies from drinking 2 cups of wine. I mean, it's just really, really weird stuff, which, again, just from lack of reading this literature and it not being that common in this wonky discipline that's hard to find a job in these days, it's not very well known. But, if you take all that knowledge and apply it to the New Testament, it raises profound questions about the Eucharist.
Yeah. So another important point to kind of lay this out is that while the Greeks were migrating all over the place, they were also in Italy. They had been in Italy for a long time, at this like huge portion of the Italian coast. They call it Magna Graecia, and not far from Rome, which is shortly after Plato and Socrates, kind of the seat of power of the world. And that's kind of where everything was going on. So there was like this kind of commerce between these, Greeks, religious Greeks. And, well, I don't know if that's the right term, but Greeks who are actively playing with this wine and probably doing important rituals. Yeah, exposure to, the Roman leadership was probably happening quite a bit. And, Marcus Aurelius being a known initiate, like that's kind of a helpful argument. But just the fact that they were already there, close to Rome, quite active. And, the Christians were probably also all over the Mediterranean. And so this idea that, this is kind of a difficult bridge for me. I've only read your book twice. I didn't write it. So I'll probably ask you, like, how do you like to develop this bridge from like, okay, you got ancient Greece and Rome, and then like secret Christians trying not to get killed, and, trying to get their religion established in, the Italian peninsula and Roman Empire. But, possibly, and this is a core part of your argument, important part of your argument, like, was the Eucharist psychedelic at the beginning, the first couple hundred years?
Right. It's a big question, and it's a controversial question, but it rests on very, very simple premises. And I'm not asking about the wine at the Last Supper, which is the Holy Grail, right? We've been crusading to find the Holy Grail along with Indiana Jones for generations, and no one's found it. But that's important. There is no archaeological evidence for that wine, for the original wine that was consumed at that supper. So in the absence of that, where do we look for evidence of what was really happening in Paleo-Christianity, those 300 precious years after the death of Jesus, when Christianity was illegal, right? This was an illegal cult before Constantine in the 4th century AD. And at the time, there were no churches, there were no basilicas, there was no canonical gospels, there was no book or doctrine and dogma to look to. This was a religion that was trying to find its feet, and it was trying to find its feet among Greek speakers. So obviously Jesus is preaching in Galilee, and it's where the seeds of this religion pop up, but they don't begin to fruit until later, and in other parts of the Greek-speaking Mediterranean. So Paul, for example, St. Paul and his great epistles, which are 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament, he's writing in Greek to Greek speakers in places like Corinth. The letter to the Corinthians. Corinth today is about an hour west of Eleusis, that same capital, that spiritual capital of the ancient world that called to everybody from Plato to Marcus Aurelius. The most famous of these mysteries is now an hour east of the same community that St. Paul was writing to in an effort to birth this new religion of Jesus. Now, the odds that these Corinthians either weren't themselves initiated in Eleusis or didn't know somebody who was, maybe even a parent or a grandparent or brother or sister, is absurd. And they're not too far from Delphi, the Oracle at Delphi, and all this mystery and magic that we associate with the ancient world. How do you sell a bunch of Corinthians on this new religion based on wine unless you're tapping into and using language they could understand? And I think that really comes to the fore in the Gospel of John. And I spend a whole chapter comparing the Greek of the Gospel of John to the Greek of Euripides based on scholarship that's not mine, but relatively respected biblical scholars like Dennis MacDonald. He writes this book a couple of years ago called the Dionysian Gospel. For obvious reasons. The Gospel of John is written as a way that presents Jesus as kind of this reiteration, even a reincarnation of the Greek god of ecstasy and wine, Dionysus. And the whole point of the Dionysian religion, which is another of these mysteries out there, along with the mysteries of Eleusis, is to drink wine and find communion with that god in total religious ecstasy and rapture. The Christianity is not so different. It's explicit in the Gospel of John. When Jesus asks us to drink his blood and become one with him, it's the same promise. It's an identical promise that the Greeks would have recognized from their other mystery traditions. And so again, lots of well-founded questions about who these early Christians were and what the Eucharist meant to them.
So Brian, I think the first popularization of this pagan, pop culture manifestation of this pagan continuity hypothesis was those zeitgeist films that were a little weird way back. When did that stuff come out? Like 2007 was like the first time I think a lot of people were exposed to the idea that like the Jesus story matched really closely with a number of previous things, like Dionysus, for instance. I'm not going to suggest people go watch that film, but that's where I kind of it came on my radar. I thought it was really interesting. And, you made a really great, case for like the similarities between Dionysus and the Jesus story. It's pretty amazing.
It's not that's the thing. It's not this isn't a new idea. It's not my case. I'm just collecting the evidence that's been there for a long time. The same as I do with the Greek and the Latin. It's just that it's uncommon and it's sequestered and it's largely ignored. It's the same with this pagan continuity hypothesis, and I think where people get in trouble is trying to liken Jesus to every single Near Eastern fertility cult that was out there. So it's not just that there was this relationship between Jesus and Dionysus, which I think is the only one that matters, by the way, when you're talking about early Christianity, because it was spread amongst Greek speakers in Greece and Italy, which was Great Greece at the time. I don't think you need to make every comparison to Osiris or Attis or Adonis or all of these Near Eastern gods. I mean, amongst some of them, there are similarities. And I think that the conclusion people try to draw from that is that, Jesus never existed, or all these stories are bullshit, and that this is just, an amalgamation of all these traditions that preceded Christianity, and it's all a scam. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that there was a historical Jesus, and I think that, we have these relatively conflicting accounts of what he was and what the message was in the canonical gospels that have come down to us. But we have these other gospels and this Gnostic literature that didn't make it in the Bible, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And what comes across to me time and again are people trying to find ecstasy, people looking for communion, right, with Jesus. And again, you don't have to look off into all this esoteric stuff just to focus on the very simple proposition that the Eucharist is an immortality potion. I mean, plain and simple. It's no coincidence, I think, that a church father like Ignatius of Antioch in the early 2nd century AD, he refers to the Eucharist in his letter to the Ephesians as the pharmakon athanasias, the drug of immortality. Now, is that just a play on words, or was he tapping into that pharmacratic tradition of spiked wine that we're talking about now? I mean, again, very well-founded questions if you just focus on the Greek and the very Greek world in which Christianity was born.
Right. That was another compelling point. Like this Greek language is so fundamental to like early Christian life. Like probably for the first 1,000 years of, the Catholic Church, it was like, well, it probably still is quite important. Like I imagine most priests, I've only met a handful of priests, but I imagine most priests are taught some Greek so they can read the original work. Actually, you probably know more priests than me. Is that kind of off, somewhat in?
No, I think you're right. I mean, in seminary, I think I would hope that most priests learn some basic ecclesiastical Greek. I mean, in the Greek Orthodox Church, I would hope all of them do.
Yeah,
which is important. And I often wonder myself how Latin became the sacred language of the West when we have this ancient Greek and the New Testament is written in Greek. How did that disappear in the West? Interesting questions. But I think that it's impossible. I've been saying it is impossible to understand the roots of Christianity without understanding your ancient Greek. And it's not just a silly academic point that there are mistranslations and things like that. It's the language and culture in which this religion was born was highly Hellenistic. And to miss that is to miss some very subtle points and some not so subtle points. And I'll give you one not so subtle point from the Gospel of John. Everyone knows about the wedding at Cana, the famous water to wine miracle. I'm not sure if many folks know that only occurs in the Gospel of John, in this Dionysian Gospel. And there are lots of things that only occur in the Gospel of John that scream the mysteries of Dionysus. That this concept of changing water to wine was a tradition that existed among Greek speakers for centuries before Jesus. This idea of placing water in these basins at the temple in Elis on the Peloponnese west of Athens, and then coming back the next day and finding this water miraculously transformed to wine. This was an annual miracle that was said to take place on January 5th, January 6th, the very same day that we celebrate the Epiphany of Christ today. I mean, so it's not to say that Jesus didn't exist and it's all just, a plagiarism of what came before. It's that the John and the other writers were tapping into this tradition to speak to Greeks on their terms. And as long as you're doing that, what are we really saying about this wine? I mean, what is the whole message about the wedding at Cana? When the water is changed to wine for people who are already drunk, by the way. And you can look at the Greek in the Gospel of John to see for yourself that they were already drunk. The steward is asking Jesus, like, why are you uncorking this stuff at this point in the night when people are shit-faced, essentially? And so it wasn't to get them drunk. There was something else happening there. And we find this thread all the way throughout the Gospels of these immortality potions.
Yeah, like, was he dosing people when they were already drunk? That's quite the... Quite the question. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, we've got to speak to people in their language and, using stories, analogies they're familiar with. You can't just like start using some obscure Russian things to talk to these Greeks. You've got to use what they're, living in. Yeah. And I think worth noting, Corinth, halfway essentially in between Athens and Sparta, like really strategically located place. Looks like it's probably a nice port as well, harbor. So it's probably a lot of commerce there, a lot of people. Yeah. Okay. So back to this like interesting kind of story. Like, it seems like, I kept loving this kind of concept of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It kind of seemed like a big portion of what was going on here is, we've got the women who are kind of in control of the drugs. They seem to be stewards of this thing in a lot of ways. And perhaps in proto-Christianity, they, weren't as repressed as they are today, or were, 500 AD even in the world of the Catholic Church. And women eventually were quite suppressed. I guess the Roman culture was quite more patriarchal than other cultures. And, empire mattered to them quite a bit. So they wanted everything to be kind of consistent throughout, and men would be in control. Women could do what women do, and then there was suppression. So it almost feels like the male dominated Roman Empire kind of kicked out the women, kind of demonized them into witches, cast them to the edges of the empire, and at the same time were able to kind of neuter the Eucharist to be a non-drug Eucharist. And, that's, to me, this is kind of where the Latin comes in. They're like, okay, cool. Well, let's suppress the Greek and let's just keep doing this Latin thing because that's what we do in the empire. And it helps our agenda a little bit. But this is me being a amateur and speculating with my conspiracy lens. How do you kind of frame this kind of like suppression of women and possibly the suppression of drugs into kind of a no longer active drug concoction?
Yeah, again, when you look at the sources, there is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, if you consider flutes rock and roll, there was maybe early Jethro
maybe a
Tull.
pan flute. Yeah,
exactly. So this is definitely there. I mean, the mystery, especially the mysteries of Dionysus, and these are the two things we always have to keep in mind: the mysteries of Dionysus and the mysteries of Jesus. And I like to say that I don't think that the pagan world went to bed in 33 AD and woke up Christian in 34 after the death of Jesus. There was this 300-year intercultural process where those Greek traditions, those Greek sacraments didn't just disappear. As a matter of fact, they probably didn't disappear in the 4th century either. But by the time Christianity was on the rise, you do see the church fathers and church bureaucracy essentially just replacing what came before, which was the very patriarchal Roman Empire. It's not any real surprise why it was only men who were extended the power, the power of consecration. I mean, make no mistake about it. To consecrate the Eucharist is to control the flesh and blood of Jesus. And that was restricted to men. It's a very powerful signal that was sent around the Roman Empire. And it begins happening as early as the 2nd century into the 3rd centuries AD. You have church fathers yelling at heretics, essentially, the Gnostics, who were after this direct experience of the divine. And we know from a church father like Hippolytus, for example, that they were mixing some kind of drug into their wine that was being consecrated by women. In his Refutation of All Heresies, written in Greek, Hippolytus includes the word pharmakon 7 times in a row, 7 times, when he's talking about the Eucharist that was used by one of these Gnostic groups, the followers of Marcus. I mean, so we do know that women were integral to some aspects and to some communities that were present at the time. And I spent a lot of time spelunking through the catacombs under Rome, looking at these frescoes. And what you find are frescoes, again, where women are consecrating all this wine in this very strange ritual that was called a refrigerium, where we get the word refrigerator, which my favorite translation is from the Yale emeritus professor Ramsay MacMullen. He calls it a chill out. This is 93-year-old MacMullen, probably the world's leading authority on ancient Roman ritual. He says that this refrigerium is where the dead themselves participated. Again, this is why I talk about graveyard. Now, here's a graveyard wine, right? So in a tradition that might go back to the Stone Age, under the streets of Rome, indeed, under St. Peter's Basilica, in what is known today as the necropolis, the Vatican necropolis, we have evidence of people participating in these refrigeria where the living and the dead are interacting. And Ramsay MacMullen at Yale says that a party mood was essential. These were wine parties. Think of it like the Day of the Dead ceremonies and the celebrations in the graveyards in Mexico, for example. People tried to stay close to their ancestors, and it seemed that magical wine was one of the things that facilitated that exchange. Again, where women are integral. And now where the refrigerium ends and the proto-mass begins, nobody knows. But Ramsay himself does say that there were Christianized refrigeria being celebrated all over Rome.
That's super interesting. Yeah. This idea of ancestor worship or like having some sort of commerce with the deceased it's like worldwide tradition too. It's like not that spooky of an idea. Like even in, modern Santeria, voodoo, whatever, like there's still this kind of ancestor worship, and like having a little altar for your ancestors, like pretty common, I think. So like, it's not that new or like weird of an idea that they would want to do that.
No, and I think that's I do think that that's what the Eucharist really is. I mean, even if you listen very closely to the Eucharist of the liturgy today, if you're a good Catholic boy like me, and you've memorized the liturgy of the Eucharist, it's this phrase that comes up again and again is the communion of saints. This idea that you're praying for the living and the dead, and the living and the dead converge in the literal body and blood of Jesus during the consecration of the Mass. It is the spiritual food, not just for us, but for our ancestors who've died. And there are all these intercessions for those who've recently died, as any good Catholic knows. On every Sunday, the names of the dead are read out, and the whole Mass is dedicated to the memory of the dead. And it's an idea that goes back, I mean, not just to the agricultural revolution, but potentially tens and tens of thousands of years. This idea of communing with the ancestors. It shows up as a kind of death cult at Göbekli Tepe. It shows up in this weird ritual I call the Marzeya, which I write about. This Canaanite tradition of communing with the dead that finds itself into the Holy Land. You see the same thing with Dionysus, who is seen as the Lord of Death, right, leading this kind of Halloween type parade when his wine is uncorked at this springtime festival called the Anthesteria. And there's Jesus, stepping into this line. After Osiris and El and Dionysus, you find Jesus doing the same thing. Jesus, there's this famous harrowing of hell episode where he's not just preaching to the living, but to the dead, right? So the same notion shows up again and again in the ancient traditions.
Yeah. I think it's such an important discussion, because how many people have this like communion with Jesus every Sunday of sorts, but don't really feel much. Like you're
of sorts.
very different from acid, very different from ayahuasca.
That's the problem. I mean, and I raise these questions not to be subversive, and not to attack or impugn anybody, but because 69% of American Catholics do not believe in the church's core doctrine of transubstantiation. This is according to a recent Pew poll. If you don't believe that you are literally consuming the flesh and blood of Jesus, then what's the point? I mean, the Greeks did. I can tell you that the Maenads, the followers of Dionysius, certainly did. The folks who went to Eleusis certainly thought they were consuming something that connected them with the divine, something that made Athens the most exceptional and divine thing ancient Greece ever produced, something that called to Marcus Aurelius centuries later, something that it seems was suppressed at some point. And maybe it's just a factor of these secret traditions, dying under the weight of their own secrecy. Maybe it's part of the Inquisition, which comes later, and these witch hunts that manage to erase a lot of the sacred pharmacopoeia that used to exist in the West. There's probably lots of different factors at play, but I think we're on safe territory asking very basic questions about the kinds of sacraments that people use to touch God.
Right. The list of quote unquote technologies is sacred is vast. Like everything from putting hooks in your chest and hanging out for a couple days to lying down in a cave for 3 days, possibly. Like this, I don't know if you're aware, but there's like a whole tradition right now, not tradition, but probably subculture where people will go on these darkness retreats for like, I think 2 weeks at a time, maybe. It's pretty intense. And it rhymes a lot with these ancient rites that are, possibly part of this whole thing.
Yeah, you don't need drugs. You don't need drugs. I mean, 3 days in a cave will do it. Not eating or drinking for a few days will certainly do it. Plunging hooks into your chest will certainly do it. There's a lot of things that do it. These archaic techniques of ecstasy that my fellow Romanian scholar Eliade refers to. I mean, there's no shortage of opportunities, and yet, included in that list and not exclusive are these sacraments. Jesus is talking about consuming his blood. He didn't say just pray to me or just worship me or just think good thoughts or just accept me as your personal Lord and Savior. He's saying to drink my blood for a reason. And anyone who does that becomes immortal, has immortality, is what he says in the Gospel of John in Greek, in the present tense. If you drink it, you have immortality. Not that there's life after death. You become immortal right here, right now. And again, it's circumstantial, but if you talk to some of these modern day volunteers in the psilocybin experiments, you hear very similar language about transcending time and space and finding this sense of eternity. What Dinah Baser, one of the volunteers in the NYU experiments, she describes to me, and I profile her in the book, she describes this sense of eternity where every moment is an eternity of its own. She uses that language. I mean, it sounds mystical to me.
Right. I was actually able to get 2 NYU study participants on the show before their results were published.
Oh, wow.
It was really, really fun. I hopefully didn't piss off too many people at NYU, but it was like really interesting to hear their stories. Yeah. And get to know them. But, because I hear about this stuff in the wild, like there's plenty of mushrooms out there. But, how often do you hear about it in a controlled environment like that? So it was really, really interesting. And yeah.
Right. Well, you're going to hear a lot more about it.
That's for sure. And yeah, like the timelessness, the mystical experience, like the MEQ, the mystical experience questionnaire. It's kind of funny, right? Like how we started talking about this, like how mystical was your experience? I don't know. I got like a 7.5. It's like, to me, it's kind of like a on or off, but I get it. There's some mystical qualities in some experiences. It can be while you're gardening or, making up magical wines or, in the midst of a Grateful Dead show or in the middle of the Amazon. It's like these things can all happen at all these different places. And I wouldn't be surprised if in his later days, Tim Leary, when he became Catholic again, a practicing Catholic again. He, I wouldn't be surprised if he was on acid at some of the masses he attended. It's kind of an interesting theory. I've not seen any real evidence, but it just seems like something he would do. Yeah. So I guess in this story, you've kind of talked about like, yes, women and drugs have been very suppressed by the church. And like, is part of your hope that Catholics might examine this and might examine like the psychedelic renaissance more deeply to see if there's a way to bring psychedelics back into their religion?
I think that's a very fair way to put it. Just examine, right? And I think that even with the academic disciplines, I think part of the reason here behind all this, my 12-year adventure, is to just raise this to a level where we can have sober academic discussions about the evidence. And so I present all this evidence, some of which we talked about, some of which we haven't talked about. But that ergotized beer in Spain, for example, is pretty compelling. I won't go as far to call it a smoking gun, but I do think it begs the question about the composition of these sacraments. And I do think it sets up this discipline for more funding, more attention from across disciplines, not just archaeochemistry and archaeobotany, but the classicists and historians and biblical scholars and folks at seminaries and divinity schools. Harvard Divinity School is running a year-long lecture series on psychedelics and the future of religion. So this stuff is being taken seriously at the highest levels of academia, and there is appropriate skepticism involved, which I think you need on something like this, where we don't have that much data. But as more data comes in the years to come, I think the question arises: what can organized religion do with this? I think there's all kinds of things that could happen. One of the most obvious, I think, is end of life. The folks at Hofmann, NYU, now UCLA are studying psilocybin for end of life distress. And it's really intriguing for me to think about someone, late in life, facing their death, to avail themselves of what in the Catholic tradition is called like these last rites, this viaticum, your last Eucharist. If that becomes available, like we think it may be available in Oregon, by the way, in a couple of years, which would be the first jurisdiction on the planet to have a regulated therapeutic psilocybin system. As part of that, if it's approved for end-of-life distress, within 2 years, you may find people in Portland who are going through a kind of mystery type experience with this psilocybin. And for those at the end of life in particular, of course, you want a medical professional involved. That'll probably be part of the regulations, or someone who's been licensed to perform one of these therapeutic interventions. But at the same time, say, you're 80 or 90 years old and you've been going to church every Sunday since as long as you can remember. Wouldn't you want your priest there with you to administer a kind of sacrament? Not one that you find every Sunday, but at the very end of your life, if you're told through the scientific literature that it has this incredible effect on anxiety and depression and the pain, suffering that people have at the end of life. I mean, what an incredible technology to incorporate into organized faith. What an opportunity for priests and pastors and clergy to guide their faithful through one of the most transformative events of their life.
So our teacher Lenny regularly suggests that the more ideal future for psychedelics is not in psychiatry, it's in pastoral counseling. And we've been spending a lot of time with the Claremont School of Theology and the Center for Process Studies, because there seems to be an overlap there between the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and this psychedelic worldview and theology. That could be quite compatible and compelling for people in this, more religious worldview. I think you're probably aware, because you've been studying this for a long time, but there are 2 Brazilian Christian ayahuasca churches that are legal in the U.S., right? The Santo Daime and the UDV.
Of course.
Yeah. So I think there could be an interesting model there. The mass might be a little, messier. There might be more cleanup required, but that could be an interesting model. Like how, could some, it's really tough, right? Because large institutions don't like to move quickly. and the largest, oldest institution really kind of exemplifies that, Roman Church, Church of Rome. So like how I would love to see it play out, and it might just be a bumpy ride for a little bit for Catholics who are interested in bringing this in. But, I imagine there's a number of priests who have already read your book, including in the Vatican. And
there are quite a few. I talk to them a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And they're probably interested and like, maybe we should really think about this.
I will say this without betraying any confidences.
Yes.
There are, I talk to lots of different priests. I talk to lots of Catholic priests about this. And I'm shocked by the open-mindedness. And I think part of it is that I'm a psychedelic virgin. I don't really have a dog in this fight. I look to the science, both the psychopharmacology and the archaeochemistry, to try and make heads or tails of this stuff. I'm not pushing for anything aside from good scholarship. I'm a proponent of good scholarship. I'm also a proponent of public health. And, this is already happening in Oregon. And it will not be the last state. There will be other states that follow this model. Eventually, the federal government will get involved. The FDA is probably going to get involved sooner than later in some of these clinical trials and approving psilocybin, for example, for all these conditions like anxiety, depression, and PTSD and end-of-life distress. I mean, it's happening, right? It's not going to happen tomorrow, but between now and 2030, there's going to be a hell of a transformation in mental health care and medicine, and I would argue religion, because more and more questions and more people looking at these experiences objectively are going to force a conversation, an examination, as you put it, which I think is the best way forward. Just to examine this stuff and see where it falls.
Right. And say somebody's, 65, they've been a lifelong Catholic, went to Mass every Sunday, and then they take a quick trip to Oregon and they have their first mystical experience, their first real religious experience of their life. And, what does that mean when they go back to Mass like the following Sunday? Like it's quite a transformative thing. And when this happens at scale, like I think there will be pressures on the Catholic Church to look at this more seriously. Yeah. I would love to see more women included in the Catholic Church. I feel like nuns kind of get the bum end of the stick here often.
It's been a couple thousand years. It might be time to reconsider.
Right. And do you get pushback from some priests on the women aspect of this, the female aspect of this?
Again, time will play this out, but the honest answer right now is not that much. To be, I don't think I'm saying anything that controversial. Right. I don't understand how half of the faithful can be denied positions of leadership like that in the Eucharist. Again, the consecration of the flesh and blood of Jesus is the thing, right? It is the thing that is essential for salvation, says Pope Francis. How we can restrict that sacred obligation to men doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't make a lot of sense to lots of people. So I think people realize it's the conversation has to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this visual. It's kind of sadistic maybe, but Dionysus getting torn to shreds then devoured, literally, like being this precursor thing. It's like such a violent idea, but isn't ritualized cannibalism also kind of violent and brutal?
Yeah, I think so. Well, there's the Eucharist, by the way. The image that you're evoking comes from Euripides, amongst other sources, but that's 405 BC, more than 4 centuries before Jesus. The tearing apart of these sacrificial animals was referred to as the homophagon charin. This the same root as Eucharist, Eucharisto. So it's a very old idea there, and 100% Greek. It's not good. The Last Supper was not a Passover meal. There aren't many humans served up in today's Passovers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just one.
Just
if he's human. Yeah, it's a really, I think important book you've put together, Brian. I hope people really read it and think about this deeply. I usually call myself, I was raised somewhat Catholic, but I got out of the church pretty early telling my parents that organs gave me a headache. But, yeah, right. I had to get out somehow. But, the idea, I, as many other people do, struggle with the Catholic Church. But I think this is like an optimistic reframing. Most organized religion, by the way, not just the Catholic Church. I try to pick on everybody fairly, equally. But, I got some problems, like this idea of, suppression of women. It's a big deal. And perhaps that's a Roman legacy, not a Greek legacy.
I agree.
Yeah. And how, I get a little bothered by the secret archives, but I'm glad to know that people can get access like yourself, which is kind of amazing, by the way. I was blown away that you were able to get in there.
So was I.
It only took a whole year to plan that out, or
more or less, or 12. Yeah.
Oh my God. Nice work. But yeah, just amazing. Like the fact that we've got, these archives that could really help us with history, but they're kind of suppressed, not exactly suppressed. Like I find that a little problematic, in the wake of, the legacy of, was it Constantine who helped destroy a lot of the pagan legacy, like the library at Alexandria?
That was later. It was largely under Theodosius, the end of the 4th century.
Like there's a lot of really tough legacy, for intellectuals to deal with, and like I'm interested and hopeful that there could be some sort of reform. Hopefully psychedelically informed, in my mind. It could be breath work if they don't want to bring acid in, but it could be a really interesting thing.
I agree. And I hear, you're not the first person who's voiced that to me, obviously.
Right.
I send all these interviews to the Vatican and to see what becomes of them.
Good. Yeah, I like that. And, I'm hopeful. And I've met a few Jesuits, and I've always just been impressed with how intellectually powerful they are. I think it's something about their education, and the fact that they are open-minded and interested could mean that reform could happen in the next 10 to 100 years. So it's an old organization, right? So we don't want to move too fast. Yeah. So yeah. Well, anything else we might want to hit, or I don't want to give away the whole book. I felt like I gave away too much already. I think people should buy it.
Well, thank you. I think so too. I also think the Audible seems to be resonating with people. We're doing pretty well across the world, by the way. Because it's not that easy right now to find the hardcover. We are shipping to as many places as possible, but the Audible, which I read and takes about 15 hours, is proving an entertaining product for people. So if you're interested in listening while you work, there's an option.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd suggest people check out your Joe Rogan interview. Were there any other interviews you did that you think were special?
Oh, I love them all, the present one included. And I upload every single one to my website, which I'm not going to spell my name, but if you go to theimmortalitykey.com, it'll transfer you over to my website, and you can see all the media there.
All right. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you coming on. And I hope you continue on. And I hope the legacy isn't just Catholic Church reform. I hope it's more classics, professors and students. And, I just hope this thing keeps going. There's a lot of work left to do in a lot of areas, not just medical, but classics included. And I'm excited to see what happens in the next 5-10 years.
Thank you. Well, we're not finished yet. So this really is just getting started.
All right. Well, until next time, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Brian Muraresku and Joe. I know I really enjoyed listening to it, learned a ton. Yeah, and just some takeaways for me is I really kind of like to think about that idea about the different wines and beers that were drank back then. And I think really trying to change our perception around what wine and beer is with what it is today, and just thinking that how different it could have been, and possibly how some of these, drinks were psychoactive, adding different spices, different herbs into it, had different, probably fermenting techniques. And, so to speculate that some of these earlier traditions and religions had some sort of psychoactive concoction or brew, I don't know, it doesn't seem too far-fetched in my mind. And I think Brian really kind of highlights all this through his research, and I think makes some good arguments for it. Again, if you want to check out more of Brian's work, you can check his website out, brianmuraresku.com, and highly recommend getting the Immortality Key, whether that's the audiobook, the ebook, or the physical book. So definitely grab that if you're interested in learning more about this topic. If you have any questions, comments about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com. Always love to hear some feedback. And again, be sure to subscribe to us on our social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And subscribe to our podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast apps and sites. So Psychedelics Today. And if you're feeling called to it, we'd love to see a review on iTunes. That just helps us out a whole bunch. So that's it for today, folks. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful week whenever you're listening to this. And thank you so much for your support. And we will catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today.